And let's go ahead. Share screen. Number 2, share, and then off we go. All right. Welcome to New Patient School, everybody. I hope you are doing well. My name is Sam Carlson, and I'm here with the trainer extraordinaire, Dr. Andrew Wells. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to be talking about how to build a self-running practice with proven tactics, trainings, and scripts. It's funny because as we put this one out, we have, I didn't want to put a ton of salacious selling behind what this thing is. And I wanted it to stand on its merit. If you want to have a practice where you can leave for a day, for a week, for a month, and your practice will not lose income, not drop off and decline in patients, and your staff doesn't run amok, then this is the training that you need to be on. New Patient School, what is this? What is New Patient Stream? Why are we here? Well, first of all, we are powered by Patient Stream. We have a singular goal. Our goal is to help docs grow their practices by providing the only software that allows you to run niche-specific marketing campaigns. We provide training on the most effective methods to increase new patient conversions and a community of docs with the same drive and passion to get new patients. Okay, and we want to make it easy so anybody can do it, even this dumb little dodo. I do this training with my good buddy, Dr. Andrew Wells. Andrew's an awesome guy, owner of Simplified Integration, and now co-owner in Simplified Functional Medicine, correct?
That's right.
It's
as of yesterday.
As of yesterday. Congratulations on
yesterday, I should say. Thank you.
Yeah, congratulations on the launch of your new program. Look forward to hearing more about that. It's an awesome way for docs to add functional medicine into their practices in pretty quick and easy way. He's also got a podcast called the Simplified Integration Podcast, husband, father, practice coach, and he's got a really nice beard. So anyway,
thanks, man.
Andrew, thanks for being here, buddy. Once again, congratulations on your launch yesterday. And I am looking forward to today's training. Maybe, and I don't run a practice, but I used to coach practices, and I used to try and implement a lot of the things that we're going to, or rather, I used to help docs and their staff implement a lot of what we're going to be talking about here today. And I know it can be a challenge, but I also know it's probably the single most important thing by far that you can do if you want to actually own what I would consider a business. So I will go ahead and turn the time over to you, my friend. And as always, just let me know when you want to let me, when you want the next slide, and we'll go from there.
Cool. Thanks, man. Yeah, like you said, this is, as I was typing up the slides for this training, it really dawned on me that this is really extremely valuable information. And there were a couple turning points in my career. This was one of them. And it was this day in particular. And I almost feel like I fell into it, and totally by accident. And I look back on this day, I remember it vividly, and it was not, so here's the story, by the way. We had, I was very much started off as a personality driven office, meaning that they were coming in to see Dr. Wells. Dr. Wells is the guy who's going to get them better, and everything really revolved around me.
Right.
Then we integrated our office, and our office grew really quickly. So we did medical integration. We hired a nurse practitioner and medical doctor. We had these new services that we were offering, and we kind of struggled at first, and then all of a sudden our office just, we implemented some key things, and our practice just blew up. And this one day, it was a Friday, just like today, and we were maybe like a year into practice and just rocking and rolling, and I was scheduled to leave that day for a seminar. I was leaving town. And so I stopped by the office in the morning before I left. And I was, before we started seeing patients, I was running around talking to my office manager and case manager and the chiropractor and nurse. I'm like, hey, you guys got everything? Hey, we have 3 new patients today. We have 2 reported findings. Are you guys good? Are we ready? And I remember my case manager in particular, she pulled me aside and she goes, Dr. Wells, we got this. Just leave. We're fine. You don't need to babysit us. She's like, just leave. And everyone and the front desk started laughing, like, yeah, we got this. Like, leave, Dr. Wells. You're fine. You don't have to worry about us. We got it under control. And so I got in my car, and I remember pulling away from the office, and I pulled by the front of the office slowly, and I could see in the windows. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, what am I doing? I'm leaving the office. The office is running, and I'm going to a seminar. And my brain exploded. I'm like, first of all, I was freaked out. Second of all, I felt like I was robbing a bank. I'm like, how is it that I can go leave? Truly, man, I felt guilty. It's the weirdest thing. I felt totally guilty. I'm like, these people aren't here working, and I'm off to a seminar. And I'm like, this is totally nuts. I'm like, how did this happen? And so our Friday mornings were like really short shifts. It was like at 9:30 or 9 o'clock to 11:30. And I remember calling the office later that day, like at 1 o'clock, called my office manager, and she's like, I'm like, how'd it go? She's like, well, all of our new patients showed up. They did really well. We had 2 reported findings, both patients closed. And I looked at our numbers, our production numbers, and we had a decent day. I think we did it was like 12 or 16,000 something in terms of production that day. So it was a pretty decent day. And I wasn't there. And I'm like, holy cow, like, how did this happen? And then all of a sudden I'm like, what could I be doing with my time? Like, clearly these people don't need me anymore. Like, I don't need to show up. And so it really shifted my mindset. I'm like, man, whereas before, and here's the funny thing, I never intended to do that at all. It was never my intention to, have the practice run without me being there. I had this understanding that I had to be there for things to run. And that was the first day that I realized that I didn't need to be there. And so I'm looking back, I'm like, how did this happen? And this is what this training is about today. So for the docs who are on here, I'm really happy you're on here. I'm going to show you exactly how he did it. And it's actually not hard. It's really common sense stuff. It's going to take a little bit of effort. There's some steps you have to do, but anybody can do this. Now, here's the one thing I'll tell you is that some docs, I talk to docs a lot about this a lot. Some docs are very, very happy showing up to their office every day, seeing patients, delivering good care, and then going home at the end of the day, and it's very fulfilling for them. And that's totally cool. Some docs, like me, really prefer to work on the business side and to be able to have, not have to be there like physically and emotionally showing up every day to be able to handle patient needs. And so what I'm saying is that even on a really high level or even on a small level, there are a lot of things that you can train and delegate to your staff that they can do for you without you having to do it. And some of my hangups, Sam, you probably have noticed this from docs, is like, and I used to have this hangup that only I could close patients, new patients, like only I could do the reported findings. Like there's no way that a case manager could go over insurance benefits or clinical like x-rays or lab tests. I had this idea that only I could do that as a doctor. And I came to realize that wasn't true. I didn't have to be there for new patients. I didn't have to be there for reported findings. And I'll show you exactly, how that actually worked out. So if you want to flip to the next slide. So my opinion on this changed that day. And I went from being the doctor who is like, my number one focus is my patients. And everything else was secondary. And I realized that day that actually wasn't necessarily true. And I really, in my heart of hearts, believe now that as doctors, your number one priority first should be training your staff and taking care of the people who work for you for a number of reasons. Number one, you're going to get better patient care because instead of having to focus on managing people, managing your office, you can focus on your patients or focus on your business. Number two is that, like, man, it was so much when we had a well-oiled staff and team, it was a much happier place to be. There was less chaos. It was less, it didn't feel as rushed. We had more time to focus on patients. And don't misunderstand me when I say focus on your staff. The reason we want to develop a good team is so that we can take better care of our patients. And so it was less stressful, less chaotic. We had more time. And then all of a sudden I had all this time on my hands when I realized I didn't have to be there to work on our business. And that's really when we started to see growth. And here's the cool thing, like outside of that, is that I had, for the first time in my life, free time. So my wife and I postponed our honeymoon because we didn't want to shut down the office and we didn't want to lose revenue. And our business coach at the time was like, what, you're going to take, my idiot business coach at the time criticized me for wanting to take 10 days off over Christmas to take my wife on a honeymoon, which is when I realized I had a really bad business coach. And he's like, no, you need to keep your practice open. I'm like, that's bad advice. But I bought into that for a long time. And I know a lot of doctors who, you know, if they go to seminars or they want to take a vacation or God forbid, they want to take some time off, they shut down their clinic and they're losing all this revenue. And I understand, like, it's a tough thing for doctors to navigate. And whenever I took time off, I felt really guilty that, you know, we were losing revenue because our office wasn't producing. And so when you have a really well-trained staff, you can keep your office open, and we'll show you how to do that. So next slide, por favor. So question is, well, how do you train? What do you train on? How often do you do it? And so some things I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we're going through this training. When you think about your office and when you're in your office, I used to have a notepad I'd keep with me, and I'd always be taking down notes. And I would take down notes on things that irked me or things that weren't working or like ridiculous stuff that my staff was saying. So some things you want to pay attention to is like what things that you can train on are things that aren't currently working in your office. You also want to train on things that are some of the processes that are a little bit more complicated, which we'll talk about later. How well is your staff doing? So is your staff doing a good job, or are they really deficient in some areas? Do you have a new type of program or therapy that you're introducing in your office? That changes how and when and what you'll train on. How well does your staff handle objections? I like this one a lot, the third from the last. Is your staff starting to sound like you? And when I would hear, after trainings, when I'd hear my staff like verbatim saying exactly what I would say, I'm like, oh man, this training's really paying off. And I almost pictured it as like, oh, cool, I have like these clones of myself doing things exactly the way I want it done, because they're starting to just echo me and parrot all the things that I've been saying for years. Are they getting the job done? And then what would happen if you left for 2 weeks and just weren't there? Would you have to shut down your practice, or would your staff be able to handle the processes in your clinic? So those are the kind of things I want you to keep in the back of your mind. So next slide, please. So here was our schedule. Our training schedule was every Tuesday and Thursday from 11 o'clock to noon. We very, very rarely missed training. And I don't want you to overlook this. So this is 2 hours a week, guys. You have 168 hours in the week. We dedicated 2 of those 168 hours to developing our team. Now, the biggest hurdle I see happen with clinics is doctors get kind of complacent with it or lazy with it. And they're like, well, let's just skip it this week. And then they end up skipping it the next week and then the next week. And then all of a sudden 6 months or a year goes by and no training has been done, or you're sort of doing spot training. Like when you see mistakes happening in the office, it's like, hey, hold on. That's not how we do it. Let's train on that. Let's do it right now. There's a time and a place for training. We blocked off time for it so that, you know, at 11 o'clock, our staff we were in our chairs. We had our manuals and our scripts out, which I'll show you in a minute. And everyone came prepared to train. So those are the hours that we did it. The reason I like
here. I'm sorry. I'll let you finish in just a second, but I want to just, I mean, I talk with so many owners, and I want to stop here for just a second. This is a tactical look at what Andrew did and what I see other clinics do as well. It's twice a week for an hour. How often, I want you to, if you're watching this right now, or if you're on the replay, how often do you do training? Once a month? I mean, I know clinics that never did training, never. They would never do it. And everything was reactive. Everything was flying by the seat of their pants. This is a discipline, a weekly discipline that you would do every single week. And it's like eating right or exercising, any of those kind of things. At first, with that first initial push is where the struggle is, but consistency in doing a schedule like this compounds over time. And that's what Dr. Wells, when you're hearing about his story about how he left and, production went up and all those kind of things, sure, that's not going to probably happen in your first, 2-3 weeks, but over time, that consistency and those in that like that proactive intention, that's going to give you compounding behaviors, which will which will create compounding outcomes and results. So I wanted to stop only just to point out that if you're not regularly doing training, you're never going to get closer to the idea of owning an actual business. So I'll let you get going again, but I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out.
Yeah, thanks for slowing down at that part. The payoff of doing this twice a week is monumental. I mean, there's so many. I mean, there's a financial payoff, there's a stress payoff, there is when you have, like, it solves a lot of problems. Like, I see a lot of staff turnover in offices that don't train, and staff will get, if they don't know what's expected of them, they're going to get frustrated, they'll feel stressed out, they'll feel inadequate, they're not doing a good job, and eventually they leave. And this is practices that you see a lot of, like, an employee may last for 6 months or last for a year at the most, and then they leave, just because in many cases they just don't, they're kind of confused and lost in their job. And so the payout, the 2 hours a week is such a small investment in terms of what you get out of it. And I mean, there's so many benefits. Anyway, so that's when we did our training. And having, one of the things we do as coaches is we will periodically go out to our clients' offices and we just kind of hang out and we just listen and watch. And we mainly are watching not so much the doc, but we're watching staff. And I hear this a lot, and this is not in exactly these words, but it's like, hey, does your, when we see mistakes, and the doc will get embarrassed if we see, like, staff making mistakes. I'm like, hey, I saw that, so-and-so, it seems like she botched that part of the process. And doc's like, yeah, bro, I already told them how to do that. I can't believe they keep making that mistake. I told them how to do that. I told them. And then I like this little graphic. It's keep calm and carry on repeating yourself. And my question to the doc is, well, when was the last time you trained on that? And they're like, well, we haven't. And it's like, well, show me in writing, like, where do you have that written? Like, where do you have that process written down so that your staff knows what you want out of them? Like, well, I don't really have that written down, but I did tell them. I know I told them. I've told them lots of times. And so my analogy here is this. Imagine if you're going through school, chiropractic school or high school or whatever, and you were tested on just what the professor told you verbally in class. No notes, no textbook. Hey, we're going to test you on all the things that we discussed over the last month, and you're going to have an exam on it, and just be prepared for it. How difficult would that be as a student for you to learn, assimilate, understand, and then produce that kind of information in a test? And so I see this is probably the number one issue I see in docs reaching their goals and being able to scale clinics and creating a business, is they have zero training and information written down that your a $12 an hour or a $15 an hour employee can understand and learn from. And there's just none of that. And it's a basic skill set. It's a basic business skill set to have these things in place for any business, whether you're running a car wash, a restaurant, a medical clinic, chiropractic clinic, Fortune 500 companies. They all have what they expect out of employees in writing. And so if you don't have this, I want you to think about your clinic. If you're listening to this, like, does your staff really know what's in your head, what you're expecting them to do, how you're expecting them to act, what you want them to say? Is it in writing? So that brings me to the next slide. And this is, I'm sorry, one more slide before this. So I want to talk about the concept of, you can skip ahead, Sam. Thank you to that. The scripting, back one. Yeah, that one. Sometimes I get, and I know, Sam, I know you hear this too. Sometimes we get some backlash from doctors when we start getting in the concept of scripting. And I hear this from docs, like, we understand scripting, but we really don't use it too much because I don't want my staff to sound scripted. I want it to be organic. I want them to be themselves.
Well,
and
they associate it with a salesperson.
Right. That's exactly it. It's like, for some reason, docs think that it's going to make their employees robotic or mechanical or, like it's too structured. And here's the problem with that way of thinking. And I compare it to the show, Whose Line Is It Anyway? And so that is an unscripted show. So they give you a premise and they have the actors that act out this premise. And so they're not using any scripting. And now I've been to a couple Broadway shows and like plays and things like that. I've never heard someone leave a Broadway play and be like, that thing was so scripted. You hear people say like, they'll either say like that was a bad show or that was a good show, but the good shows, like the ones that win like the Tonys or whatever their award thing is, the reason they're really good on Broadway is because they're so freaking scripted that it's just, they can reproduce this really high quality over and over and over and over again. They're acting, of course, but it's 100% scripted. Any play, any performance, any movie, any TV show, it all starts with a good script. And so if you're not using a script, what you end up getting is this Whose Line Is It Anyway show where you have like actors running around sounding like clowns. And I know this is a little bit harsh, but it's so true. Is I've heard some crazy things come out of employees' mouths, and the doctors sometimes are like, I cannot believe they said that, or I cannot believe they did that. But the reason they're doing that is you haven't given them any direction. And I always tell the doctors, and I don't mean this in a mean way or whatever, but I always tell the doctors like, hey, that's your fault for not training them. Like they should know how to act and know what to say. Otherwise, they're just going to default to making stuff up on their own. And patients can clearly see the difference between a Whose Line Is It Anyway type office or a very well scripted Broadway type production. And we really prided ourselves on it. We had this one employee and he was he actually he was a retired performer. So he did dance and he did like theatrical type shows. And when he came on board, one of the things that he loved was that he's like, man, you guys have scripts. He goes, this is great. This is just like my old job. So now I know exactly what to do and say. He's like, this is so cool. But the cool thing about it was, as a performer, he was still him. And so he would deliver scripts like perfectly, like line for line. But the thing was that he was so used to that was his personality, he could not help be himself. And patients loved him because he was very goofy. He was very sort of clowny, and he was always making patients laugh and feel good. And so he was still that person. He was still him, but he knew exactly what to say, when to say it. And I never had to worry about him like just going off, veering off and doing something wacky. So that, go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to say, the people who learn to communicate always win. They make more money. They have way more success. And scripting is a way to guide and put a framework so you're not just talking aimlessly. I mean, it's the same thing as the slides that we're using. We have slides to produce, a lesson with ideas, examples, and information so people can learn and adapt. And if you're just kind of going willy-nilly, especially when you're trying to like convert patients into care, everything about the marketplace is telling them to say no at every chance possible. But when you're scripted, it gives your staff the tools to, like, it really takes the pressure off. Because you know what, if it doesn't work, it's not their fault. Like, well, I followed the script, I followed the process that we have written down. Okay, well, cool. Which part didn't work? Where do you feel like it fell apart? Awesome. I'm going to take notes on that. We're going to work on it. So, man, it's so critical. I've never seen a clinic do well without this, just so you know. If your practice is not, where you want it to be, and you don't do this is one of the big reasons. So back to you, buddy.
100% true. So true. And so then there's scripting. Here's another thing, that problem that happens is docs will have these great scripts, but they never train on them. Right. Like they'll say like, hey, hey, Mary, here's the phone script. I want you to say this on the phone. And so just read through it and memorize it. And then when you answer the phone, just use the script. And then that's it. And so
Yeah.
Yeah, which kind of goes to the next slide here. And so in what we have, so this is the key thing that completely changed the way I approached our practices. We started using manuals. And I didn't have manuals in the beginning. I wasn't really familiar. It never actually dawned on me when I opened our practice that I needed these things. But what a powerful tool. So an employee manual is a guidebook. It's a roadmap. It is how to do your job in like finite detail. So when we would hire a staff member, one of the first things we would do, if not the first thing, is we'd say, hey, case manager, here is your case manager manual. And in this manual outlines exactly how to do your position. In the manual, we have all the scripts and things we want you to say, and it'll walk you through the process. So and our manuals are anywhere from 20 pages to 160 pages, depending on the complexity of that position. But we have manuals for front desk. We have manuals for case managers, for associate doctors, office managers. I even have a clinic director manual. So this is my job written down in detail. And so all the scripts and everything, all the processes scripts are in there. And this is the tool that we use to train on. So docs are like, well, what are you actually training on? Well, we just use our manuals. And now here's I think I have it in a slide coming up. Actually, if you want to skip to the next slide, I think it's on here, Sam. Yeah, this is the one. I love this slide. I would warn employees in the beginning in a really nice way. I'd say, all right, so in the next 2 weeks, I want you to have a pretty good understanding of your manual. And so I want you to read through it, go through the whole thing once, and then start going through it in pieces. And then what I would do is in the first 2 weeks, this is where we talk about additional training. So we did trainings on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But if we had a new employee, every day we would sit down for maybe 15 minutes or 20 minutes, half an hour, and I'd start going through their manual with them page by page. And over the course of a month, between them actually working and doing the job and them reading it and then also going through it with them in detail, after about a month, they're like, man, they had a really good understanding. However, inevitably, as people do, when something would come up, like a problem or a question would come up, and they'd say, hey, Dr. Wells, like, what are we supposed to do for this particular situation? And I warned my employees that my answer was always, go check your manual. And so if it was, and of course, if it's in the manual, I'd always say it really nicely, not like a douche. I'd be like, yeah, go check your manual. It's in there. It's like, hey, I think that's in your manual. And they're like, well, I don't know where it is. I'm like, look for it. You'll find it. Just like, I remember when I was a little kid, I'd always ask my mom, hey, Mom, how do you spell hippopotamus? And she'd say, look it up in the dictionary. I'm like, well, I can't look it up if I don't know how to spell it. And she's like, well, try. And I'm like, yeah, I hated that answer. But what it forced me to do as a kid was it forced me to find the answer for myself. But for our employees, what it did was if it was in the manual and I knew it was in there, I'd direct them to it. And so what they would start to do over time is like, it was kind of a joke. We'd hear our employees go, I'm going to check my manual. And they'd be like, they'd make fun of the process. But what it did was I stopped getting a bunch of questions that they already knew the answers to. And so after a while, the question just started to go away. And we also had a policy that if it wasn't in their manual, so let's say they were confused about a process or an event, and it wasn't in their manual, what I would do is say, all right, I want you to write down how you think that this situation should be handled, and then write it down and put it in my little box. So we have little mailboxes in our office. And so at the end of the day, I'd look in my mailbox and they would write out the problem. They would write out what they think the solution should be. I'd read the solution, and more times than not, they were spot on. Like, yeah, that's exactly how I would handle that situation. So then what I would say is, hey, Mary, great solution to that problem. Do me a favor, put that into your hat, because that's genius. And so they would put it in their hat. And so now we just solved a problem that wasn't in the manual. And so they're actually the manual, please understand, docs, your manuals are a living document. So you're gonna change them, you're gonna create them, you're gonna add to them as time goes on. And so over the course of months and years, you have these employees that are now starting to sort of self-train themselves and create processes because understand, like, I wasn't doing the nitty-gritty day-to-day details of these positions, they were doing it. And in more cases than not, they were better. I mean, in most cases, they were better at that position than I was because they were doing it on a daily basis. And they can your employees are smart. They can figure out solutions to problems without you having to create those solutions for you. So that's how we use those manuals. So if you don't have a manual, and by the way, like this got rid of like all the micromanaging and wasted time answering the same question over and over again. And because we use this manual as a reference, again, a roadmap for how to do that position. And then we would cross train too. So taking it one step further, we would have the case manager cross train front desk, and the front desk would cross train as the office manager. So we started actually cross training these different positions. So that way, if one person was out on maternity leave, we had someone to back up that position. Or if someone called in sick one day, they could cover that for that position and have a good understanding of how that role was supposed to go. So if you don't have a manual, were you going to say something, Sam?
Well, I was just going to add a quick experience that I think will add an extra level of impact to both the manual and the training. When I first started coaching practices, the gentleman that I was learning the business from, Sonny Gill, he is, and Sonny, I love Sonny to death, but he is like on the fly. That boy, he is like always doing something. He's so busy all the time. And so when I first came in, I was supposed to get trained up on all of their protocols because my job was going to be implementing those protocols into other clinics. So I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't understand what they were, how they worked, and why we would do them. And so what he did, this was so amazing. And I didn't think anything of it when I was doing it. But what he did was he got out a regular, 11.5 by 8 sheet of paper, or whatever the dimensions are, just a regular sheet of paper, wrote down all of the protocols that I needed to be trained on. And he had probably 24 written on there. And next to the protocol, he wrote a name and he drew an open circle. And so I was to take that list and I was to read the name, go find that person in his clinic. That person was then supposed to train me on the protocol, sign me off when I had proven that I had gotten it. I trained on the entire protocol in a day. And I was teaching protocols to a group full of doctors that weekend. And that's how important it is. I was actually teaching. Sonny put me in a room. He said, hey, we're going to kind of do a round table kind of thing. You're going to go in the room and you're going to teach the re-exam protocol. That's what you're going to teach. I'm like, okay, well, these docs, do they know that I don't know anything yet? He goes, nope, just read that protocol, know it, and teach it to them. I'm like, okay. And then guess what? I went in and I crushed it. I taught those doctors that re-exam protocol. And honestly, my experience and having run a business really played into that because I knew, running a chiropractic business is no different than running any other business. Like there's systems and processes that are the exact same. So when I did that, I knew what I was doing. But when you have these written down, when they're in a manual, when you do actual training, your staff is going to alleviate. There is so much freedom. If you're not getting the picture, hopefully that little story right there will just say, at some point in time, I don't need to be here anymore, right? Which leads to your next slide.
Yeah, this is when I knew, okay, and again, this was not my intention at all, but there was a day I walked in our practice and I looked around and I knew none of the patients. I didn't know who any of them were. I didn't know their names. I recognized some faces, but I had no idea who they were. And they were like, who's that guy? We haven't seen him before. Like, what's he doing here? Like, oh, that's the owner. And they're like, oh, okay. And so, yeah, everything was running. But again, we had written protocols. Everyone knew their job, what was expected out of them. And it was just written down, as you were just talking about, Sam, written protocols. It just reminded me, my 6-year-old, I'm trying to teach him, he got this little magic set for Christmas. And I'm teaching him these really, really basic magic tricks. And some of them I didn't know how to do them. But if you're looking at it from the outside, like the actual finished magic trick, it's like, wow, that's pretty cool. How'd you do that? That's magic. And sometimes I think that, when docs look at practices where the doc isn't even there and the practice is running and they're seeing patients and helping people, like, whoa, that's magic. Like, how do they do that? But little magic kit my son has comes with like detailed instructions and drawings. And so when you look behind the curtain, you're like, oh, that's how you do that stupid trick. Like that's so easy. Like how come I couldn't figure that out on my own? And the same thing is true. Like when we coach clients and we help them medically integrate, the first thing we do is we give them the protocols, we give them manuals very quickly in the process. Here's how your front desk handles this process. Here's how you train and hire a case manager. Here's how you do, here's how you hire and train an office manager. It's all written out. It's all in manuals. And it makes it really, that's how we learn, as humans. That's what you want to pick something up, read it, understand it, and then put it into practice. And so the day that I realized, like, wow, none of my patients know who I am, is the day I realized, wow, like what we did actually worked. The training worked, the manuals worked. Everyone can do their job at a really high level and they don't need me anymore. And so what that allowed me to do was I was busy in the background working on how to grow the practice. So how do we get more patients? How do we offer more therapies that benefit our patients? And I came to realize, I'm like, oh my gosh, like my wife and I, for the first time, could go on vacation and we could leave the practice. We'd never had the time to do that. And it completely changed our life. And so I wasn't always I was working really hard, but not always. And sometimes we just go on trips. We take a week off. And I never had the luxury to do that before. And I think a lot of docs are sort of trapped in that position. And that was the time I'm like, man, like doctors really need to know this and know how to do it. And it really became one of my missions is to help doctors get some freedom from their practice. And that's, really happy to be able to do that now and be able to give, doctors a little bit more of a quality of life and not be so chained like a ball and chain to their clinic, 5 or 6 days a week. Cool. So next slide. So how do you keep your staff accountable? So we talked about scripting, we talked about manuals. So how do you know your staff actually doing what you want them to do? We use stats. Stats are used in almost any successful business I know of. They look at stats. Any sports team, they're completely driven off stats. So I just took this little image off of, I think this is like baseball stats or something, but they plug people into positions and they coach them and train them based on their stats. Now, I think, Sam, one of the first trainings that we ever did with New Patient School was talking about stats. And so my job now at this point was, okay, everybody knows the role. Now let's keep everybody accountable. So we assigned stats to every one of to some key processes in each role. So let me give you an example. Our case manager, we knew our case manager was doing well if she was closing 80% of the day 2 patients who came in. So if 10 reported findings happened that week, 8 of those people should have started care. If it was any less than that, we would discuss it. Like, hey, why was it 60% this week? Why was it 70%? And then we would figure out, number 1, what went wrong, and number 2, what we could do to fix it. So if you go back to the beginning of this training, we talked about some things like how do you know what to train on and how do you know when to train on it? It's all based on stats. Another example is if you know that you had, and Sam, I know you get these calls a lot. It's like, hey, we had 50 leads this week, but we only had 2 people actually come in. Well, there's a reason for that. And so that's happened in our clinic too. And I know that's pretty common with like, if you're doing like Facebook ads and things like that, but there's a reason for that. And so we wanted to know why. And so if we knew that we had a 4% conversion, something happened. And that's when we start looking at, is our email system working? Is our text system working? Are we following up on new patient leads? Are we sending out reminders? Who was doing the calls that week? Were they answered on time? And so if you start to scratch the surface a little bit, when you start looking at your stats, you start to figure out really quickly where what was off that week. And it's not that like sometimes you like to blame, oh, I guess it was just a bad week, or I guess holidays are coming up, it must be that. And that's incorrect thinking. There's always a reason for our stats. It was almost like a metronome. Like our stats were so consistent over the years that if they were off, which they're always off, like some stat is always off, it's never perfect, but we were able to really quickly identify based on our stats what process was off, and then we'd train on that. And so that's why, and that's what a lot of my time people would ask me, like, what are you doing in your, what are you doing if you're not adjusting patients? Well, every day I was looking at stats at the end of the day. We'd look at daily stats, weekly stats, monthly stats, And I was using that information to figure out how I could help support my team and support my staff and giving them the resources and training that they needed to correct those systems. So it's always like a back and forth, like one stat would go off. So we'd focus, for example, I was talking about like case management. So if we focus 1 week on converting patients, that stat would go up, and then all of a sudden one stat would go down. So we'd focus our efforts on that. So it was always sort of a back and forth, like kind of ping pong match in managing stats. But what you'll notice over time is that if you're consistent with it and focusing on it and training your staff, all these stats start to get better. Every part of the process, from your new patient process, day 1, day 2, your patients get better. They become more compliant with their care. They get better results. They refer more people. And it starts to have this big snowball effect where your staff just starts to kick butt.
What were some of the key stats? Like, what were some of the ones that you were always keenly aware of? Some of the ones that you just made, like, some of just the pillar stats. What would you say?
Yeah, there were we had lots of stats. We had about a dozen key stats. Number one was, a lot of it was centered around new patients. So
Yeah.
we would have a stat for how many leads did we get, and then from that stat, it was how many people made appointments of the leads, and of the people who made appointments, how many of those people actually showed up to the clinic, and then of those people, how many of those people made it to day 2. And of that group, how many people made it to an actual signing up as a patient?
Yeah.
So it's all, all percentages. So if you get 100 people, 100 leads, you should have, 60% of those people should make an appointment. Of those 60%, you want to have, roughly 70% of those people actually showing up for day 1. So we had little spreadsheets, and by the way, our staff they were tracking themselves. So they were compiling this information.
I was talking with,
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
One last thing I want to mention is that on the front of our manuals, we would just pick one stat. So for case manager, the front, it would say, it's a case manager manual stat 80% conversion.
Oh, wow.
That was the cover page. And so they know, okay, my job is to close 80% of patients. We hired a case manager when she's a patient of ours, and we told her this. She's like, wait a minute, I close 80% of the patients? Like, yeah, that's it. And then she's like, I don't know if I can do that. I'm like, well, we're going to find out, aren't we? and she had I think the first week, I think she closed like 60%, and she was crying. She's like, I didn't get 80%. I'm like, cut yourself some slack. This was your first week. You did great. You closed over half the patients. You did such a good job. And then the next week, it was 80%. The front desk. So we'd have a front desk conversion would be, we want to make sure that 80% of our patients who scheduled appointments actually showed up for their appointment. This is for our existing patients. So if we have 100 patients scheduled to come in that week, we should have at least 80% of those people coming in. If not, we knew that we had a patient compliance problem. And maybe that means we're just really too lax on patients just canceling appointments or rescheduling. We had processes in place to handle people who were, constantly rescheduling, and so that was a stat we tracked. And that was the front desk. That was their major stat. And then we had front desk 1 and front desk 2. Front desk 2 was responsible for making sure the new patients showed up.
Yeah.
Sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say we had a user, a patient stream user, come in over the last month, and this guy's got a really successful practice, and he's doing really well, and he's ambitious, and he's done everything kind of like you're talking about. He's just built his business up really well, and his goal right now is to get 32 new patients a week. That's his goal, 32 new patients a week. And he said, well, and I know that I need to spend about $3,200 a week to do that. And when I look at patient stream, I'm wondering how much of this I should allocate to this. Because if you're wanting those types of results, you need to get more broad than just Facebook ads. You need to start doing Google AdWords. You need to really, there's a lot of online as well as tertiary marketing efforts that you need to undertake if you're going to do that. That's no small feat. And but it was just impressive to me because he knew how much money he was going to need to spend. Okay. Because he had a track record. He's like, well, it cost me about $100 or so to get a new patient into the clinic. Okay. It cost me about $100. And so, he just, it's math. He scaled it up, and so not everybody wants to have a clinic that's doing 32 new patients a week. But if you do, you won't get there without knowing the stats, knowing the numbers, doing what we're talking about. Like that won't happen without a plan. And anyway, so I just, as you're saying that, I'm like, that reminds me of this fella. And he knew that the one thing that the baseline activity was to spend $3,200. And if he was spending $3,200, that would provide an outcome that he then had to track and optimize, right? Okay, $3,200, I'm getting this many leads. My staff is doing this. Okay, we're growing, right? And that's how you have to do it. So I really like that idea, by the way, that each manual had a key KPI or a key stat rather. That's amazing. So that's a neat little nugget that I never thought of, but that's exactly right.
And the way I'd approach it with patients with that stat is like, look, at the end of the day, if you're getting this stat done, I'm going to leave you alone. And I was serious about that. I hate micromanagement. Look, at the end of the day, if you can hit this number consistently, like we're not going to have any problems. And I was I give my employees tons of slack if they're getting the job done. And so there's a lot of stuff that I would overlook and just not care about it as long as they're getting their job done. Obviously, they're not, hurting other people, but that was really my management style. Like, look, if you get your job done, this is what I want. There's one thing I want you to do, get it done. And you're always going to have a job here and I will pay you well. But oftentimes I don't think docs if I ask them, if I were to go into an office and say, how is Mary doing at her job? Most docs' response is, well, she's pretty good. Well, okay, yeah. Well, what makes her good? Oh, she's really nice and friendly, and that's really nice. Well, how do you know she's doing a good job at her role? Well, there's nothing objective about that, right? It's just like, well, some days she's doing great, some days she's not doing great. I was just having this conversation with a doctor earlier today on a coaching call. I will take a patient who's maybe a little bit rough around the edges, but still gets the job done and meets their stat every week over somebody who's like just super pleasant and great, but they're not good at actually getting that reaching their stat every week. You need people staff who can produce.
You said patient, you meant.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, staff. Yeah, you need staff that can produce. And if you haven't told them objectively, here's how we're going to measure the quality of your work, then it's all subjective, and it's really tough to make decisions based on that.
Yep.
And so here's a little bit some tactical stuff. Here are the things, like examples of what we actually train on. What I've found is that if you don't train on something over the course of 2 weeks, your staff will start to get rusty on it. And so we would have for example, on Tuesday, we would train on handling patient stream leads. Thursday, how to greet new patients. And sometimes docs laugh at me, even our staff, like, really? Like, we're going to train on how to greet somebody? And you may think that that's kind of silly, but it's actually, I think, pretty important. So we would go so far as to have one of our staff members walk through the front door with their patient paperwork in their hand, and then we would evaluate how our staff would greet that person. And I'll tell you why this is important. My wife is probably a little bit more critical than other people, but it irks my wife when she'll go into a doctor's office or something, or she, it's a new business or something she's walking into, and someone nobody looks her in the eye, or nobody if she gets a weak limp fish handshake from a doctor and the doctor doesn't look at her in the eye, all of a sudden she's distrusting of that doctor. Just because she was raised hey, when you talk to people, you look them in their eyes and you give a firm handshake. And what I see, sometimes I see in offices, no one even acknowledging that a new patient walked in the door, or greeting them in a really awkward way. And so if you're a staff member, by the way, and you're listening to this training and your doctor is awkward at greeting new patients, which by the way, I used to totally be that doctor. If you're awkward at that, let your doctor know that that you need to train on that, right? And sometimes it's a confidence issue, but there's, even simple things like how to greet a patient when they come in the door. And then we train on consultations, handling objections, closing exams, the day one checkout process. And all of these, so these are all things that are written in our employee manuals. So we're basically breaking down a small chunk of the employee manual, or that position manual, and just training on those things. And oftentimes it was just a really small part of day one. So just the checkout part or just the check-in part. And we just train on the nitty-gritty details of it. And sometimes we just train on philosophy. So we train on like, hey, why are we doing what we're doing? We talk about health statistics. We talk about, some of the shortcomings of allopathic medicine. We talk about, we go over like patient wins, right? Like so-and-so came in, they did really well. And here's why we think it went well, because we kept them accountable. Like all like, it doesn't have to be so formulaic, although most times it is. Sometimes you can make it more big picture type stuff to train on. I'd even, in some cases, just whip out do you know what green books are, Sam? Chiropractic green books?
Yes.
So I would whip out a green book from time to time, and my staff always got a kick out of like reading something that BJ Palmer wrote, or like the green books like that. They always thought that was pretty interesting. And it also got them to think a little bit differently about their position and their role and how they're actually helping serve patients and get them better. So that's it. And so we would train on this. Like, I can't count how many times we trained on how to do a consultation, like dozens and dozens. And we would train. So we would train on it so many times that sometimes our patients like, yeah, actually, I think we got that down, Dr. Wells, but I did notice that this week, we kind of fumbled up on this process. Can we train on that instead? So we would give our staff full authority to make decisions on what we needed to train on. And this is when, going back to the beginning of this training, the reason I felt okay leaving the office that day or not showing up to the office at all some days was because we had trained so much. I knew the processes were going to be in place because we trained so hard on them. And then one of the last slides we're going to go over here today, like how do you actually do training? I made the mistake initially of thinking that training was me reciting how it should be done and the staff just absorbing it and then knowing how to do it. And I realized really quickly that didn't work, and it was also extremely boring and a waste of time. So instead, we'd actually have a training schedule that we'd post on the wall. So the our staff knew that when they showed up on Tuesday at 11 o'clock, we're going to train on day 2 paperwork. And so they would show up with their employee manuals, with a notebook, with the scripting, knowing that we're going to train on day 2 checkout process. And so instead of saying, hey, here's how it should be done, we just go do it. So at 11:01, we'd all be pairing up, and then we'd be doing mock day 2 checkouts, and we'd go through it. We'd actually have our staff like physically and verbally do it. If that part of the training required paperwork, we'd actually fill out the paperwork as if we were doing it for real. And then we'd throw them some curveballs. So what if the patient says this? What happens if this happens? What happens if they're a Medicare patient and they need some extra paperwork? So we'd always throw these curveballs at them. And that's how that's how your staff becomes sort of muscle memory. And I mentioned before, when you start to hear your staff sounding like verbatim, just like you know that your training is paying off. And so make it an interactive process. The less explaining and the more role playing you can do, the better off your staff is. The better trained your staff will be, the more effective that hour of training will be. All right, so hopefully this stuff made sense to you today. This is how I worked myself out of a job, and I mean that in a good way. And so if this made sense to you today, I just encourage you, like right now, first step, if you don't have a training schedule, write down right now what that's going to be, or later today, like figure that out. Let your staff know that from here on out, whether it's going to be 1 day a week, I really encourage 2 days a week, but let them know when it's going to be and stick to it. Keep yourself accountable, have your staff keep you accountable, stick to your training schedule. And then also if you don't have any employee manuals, start making your manuals now. and start small. So the way you can do it, and the way I did it was, every day I would work on like one little paragraph of a manual. So you could start, like the easiest one to do is like start with the front desk manual. So put some goals on it. And initially it's going to be a couple pages long, but after a while, like when you get all your scripting in, you got all your stats in, and it starts to become a pretty comprehensive document. But start small. So don't feel like you have to go home and like, man, Dr. Wells says I need a front desk manual, and I don't even have that right now. It's going to take me a year to write it. Just do like one paragraph at a time or one page a week. And then over the course of, a month, you'll be able to create your manual, which just details exactly how you want that position to run. Do that for yourself. So if you're a chiropractor, and you don't, let's say you don't have here's Sam, I don't know if you know this or not, but this is a huge problem in chiropractic, is it's very tough to hire and train a chiropractor to take care of your patients the way you would want them taken care of. And the first step in doing that is just to write down all the things that are in your head on a piece of paper. And that's, how you want the patient to come in the adjusting room. What do you want them to do first? What do you want them to say? What should you be thinking, focusing on? All that stuff can be written into an employee manual. So you can essentially clone yourself and say, hey, associate chiropractor, here's how I've been doing things for the last 15 years, and here's how I would like you to do it. And you can just have them follow in your footsteps. And that's the best way to take somebody who's kind of green, or maybe has an idea, or maybe has no clue how to be an effective chiropractor or a practitioner. You can map that out for them. I really wish I had that when I was first out of school, because I had no clue what I was doing, and quite frankly was making it up as I went. And I would really have loved to have that kind of a manual to read off. Like, okay, here's how to be. You have your diploma. Here's how to be a chiropractor. You can do that, and so you can do that for an office manager, case manager, clinic director. When you have your sort of full suite of manuals, then you can literally work yourself out of a job and start focusing on other things if you want to.
Awesome. That's amazing. You do have one more slide.
Yeah, one more slide. And then, and at that point, it's just figuring out what you want to do with your time. This is all about 100%. It's not about, and I hope docs don't take this the wrong way. It's not about like, I have to have $1 million clinic, or I have to work myself out of a position. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, if you start to train your team and develop these systems, you're going to find yourself with a lot of free time on your hand. And you can do whatever you want with that free time. You can pour that back into your practice, pour that back into your team. Go take a vacation. Like maybe you want to do something like pick up rock climbing every Friday, and you can take some time away from your clinic to do fun stuff or spend time with your family. When you have this stuff dialed in your clinic, it's going to save you a massive amount of time, your most precious commodity that you have. And so that's all I've got.
No, that's awesome.
Man. I hope you guys found this valuable, and this was an absolute game changer for me. And I hope you found this valuable, and you can put some of these tools into practice for yourself.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, buddy. Thank you for that. There's some really awesome insights here, and I think that anybody who's on the training, or anybody who is watching this on the replay, I mean, this is the foundation to owning a business. I just wrote an email last night. It'll go out next week, and you're an entrepreneur first, a doctor second. And the reality is, if you want to provide better care, a better business, more stability in your practice, and all of those things, if you want it to be the best it can be, this is the foundation. Like, this is the foundation. And it doesn't come as, it's not the first instinct. It's a discipline. And so if you're running your practice and you've kind of always run it by the seat of your pants, it's time. I know there's coaching people out there. There's manuals you can get into. But the reality is most people know what to do. They just, need the discipline to sit down and do it. So anyway, we'll go ahead and call it there. I think this has been a lot of fun. Thank you guys for coming. Dr. Wells, is always super fun to be here with you. And show up to next week, you guys. New Patient School is on fire. having lots of fun, and we'll see you next week.